The door of the Providence Gulch meeting hall closed with the flat, final sound of a coffin lid. For 19-year-old Ilara, it sealed the end of one life and the beginning of something she could not yet name. Inside that room, her world had been dismantled. Her parents, taken by the winter fever a month prior, had left behind more debt than assets. Mr. Gable, the owner of the town mercantile and executor of their will, had laid it all out on the polished oak table with a grim, almost satisfied finality. The house, the tools, the furniture, all sold, all gone. What she had left was an insult, a single deed, yellowed and brittle, for a piece of land known only as the Washout. It was a deep, useless ravine 5 miles north of town, a place her father, a stonemason with a dreamer's heart, had bought for a pittance, convinced it held some secret value. The town knew better. It was a place where the wind howled and nothing grew, a scar on the land, good only for breaking wagon axles. The council, led by Gable's practical pronouncements, offered their version of charity. She could work off the remaining family debt as an indentured servant in Gable's own home. She would have a roof over her head, food in her belly. She would also have no freedom, no future, and no dignity. The faces around the table were a mixture of pity and impatience. They saw a girl, an orphan, a problem to be solved and forgotten. Ilara looked at their closed faces, at Mr. Gable's proprietary gaze, and felt a cold, hard knot form in her gut. It was the same feeling she'd had when she held her father's cold hand for the last time. It was the feeling of being utterly alone, but also of being utterly her own. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the stuffy air of the room. "The land is mine. I'll take the land." A murmur went through the council. Gable sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment in her foolishness. He pushed a small cloth bag across the table. $20, the last of her inheritance. She walked out into the biting November air, the deed in one hand, the coins in the other. She did not look back. The town saw a doomed girl walking toward her own demise. They did not see the quiet resolve hardening in her eyes, a resolve forged in the image of her father's hands, calloused and strong from shaping stone. She did not walk to the stagecoach office to buy a ticket to some kinder, unknown place in the East. She walked to the blacksmith's forge. There, she bought a good felling axe with a hickory handle, a heavy-headed pick, and a shovel with a sharpened edge. The smith eyed her purchase, then her worn dress, and shook his head, but he took her money. Her last stop was at a small farm on the edge of town, owned by a grizzled man who asked no questions. For 12 of her remaining dollars, she bought 2 nanny goats, their eyes bright and intelligent, their coats thick against the coming cold. The farmer threw in a length of rope for a lead. As she led the 2 goats out of the town's orbit, their small hooves clattering on the frozen road, she heard the whispers. She saw the pointed fingers from behind curtained windows. The story was already taking root. The foolish orphan girl, spurning the town's kindness, marching off to starve in a worthless ravine with nothing but 2 goats and a prayer. They were wrong. She had an axe, a shovel, a pick, and the memory of how her father could read the strength in a stone just by looking at it. It wasn't a prayer she was carrying. It was a plan. The journey to the Washout was a lesson in cruelty. The wind was a thief, stealing warmth from her bones. The ground was hard and uneven, threatening to turn her ankle with every step. Her pack, loaded with the new tools, salt, and a small sack of oats, dug into her shoulders until the muscles burned with a low, constant fire. The goats, Nan and Billy, were surprisingly steady companions. Their presence, a small, warm spot in the vast, cold emptiness of the high plains. They bleated softly, their breath pluming in the air, and followed her without complaint. After a day of walking, she stood at the edge of her inheritance. It was worse than the gossip had described. The washout was not a gentle valley. It was a violent gash in the earth, 100 feet deep, with walls of fractured shale and pale, dead-looking clay. The wind, which had been a constant pressure on the plains, now screamed over the ravine's edge, a physical, audible force that made her stagger. Down below, the floor was a jumble of fallen rock and skeletal trees, scoured clean by millennia of flash floods. For the first time since leaving town, despair washed over her. It was a cold, heavy tide, pulling the strength from her limbs. Her knees felt weak. The town was right. Gable was right. This was a place of ruin, a grave waiting to be filled. She looked at the goats, who were already nibbling at some hardy, frost-bitten brush near the rim. What had she done? She had traded a life of servitude for a quicker, colder death. The weight of her foolishness pressed down on her, heavier than the pack on her back. Shivering, she scrambled down a treacherous path to the bottom, seeking only a momentary escape from the relentless wind. And there, at the base of the sheer northern wall, she found it. The screaming stopped. The air was not warm, but it was profoundly, unnervingly still. The wind, hitting the opposite side of the ravine, was being funneled up and over, leaving the bottom in a pocket of strange calm. She pressed her bare hand against the wall of pale earth. It was cold, but it was the steady, deep cold of the earth, not the biting, life-stealing cold of the wind. Her eyes, adjusting to the gloom, caught a darker patch on the clay wall, a few feet from the floor. A wet sheen. She touched it, and her fingers came away damp. A seep. Slow, patient, but constant. Water. Clean water, filtering through 100 feet of earth and rock. In that moment, the despair did not vanish, but it receded. It was replaced by the first flicker of a cold, grim hope. The land was not worthless. It was simply misunderstood. Her father, the dreamer, had seen something after all. He had seen the shape of it, the way it held itself against the wind. He had seen the shelter that was already there, waiting to be carved out. The first day's work was a testament to pain. Elara chose a spot near the water seep, where the clay shale wall looked most stable. She swung the pick, a tool that felt monstrously heavy in her hands. The first strike bounced off with a dull thud, jarring her arms to the shoulder. The second strike chipped away a piece no bigger than her thumb. This was not soil. This was ancient, compressed earth, almost stone. She worked until the sun began to dip below the ravine's western rim, her progress a pathetic-looking hollow, barely deep enough to shelter her feet. Her hands were a mess of raw, weeping blisters. Every muscle in her back and shoulders screamed in protest. She made a crude camp, huddling with the goats for warmth, chewing on a piece of hard bread that tasted like dust. Sleep did not come easily. The cold seeped up from the ground, and the silence of the ravine was punctuated by the howl of the wind far overhead, a constant reminder of the world she was trying to escape. The next day, she wrapped her hands in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat. The pain was still there, a sharp, white-hot fire with every swing, but it became a rhythm. The pick broke the earth, the shovel cleared it away. Chip by chip, shovelful by shovelful, the hollow grew. She learned to read the wall, to find the softer veins of clay, and avoid the flinty nodules of rock. She was not just digging, she was sculpting, listening to the material, just as her father had listened to his stones. After a week of relentless labor, she had carved a space large enough to lie down in, a shallow cave that smelled of damp earth and her own sweat. It was not a home, but it was a start. The next task was fire. She gathered stones from the ravine floor, choosing flat, dense ones that felt solid in her hand. She remembered her father building their hearth, fitting the stones together without mortar, using their weight and shape to create a stable structure. She built a small fire pit deep inside the growing cave, leaving a gap at the back. The chimney was the true test of her ingenuity. Smoke inside the cave would be a death sentence. She had noticed a thin, vertical fissure in the rock face, running from just above her chosen spot all the way to the top of the ravine. It was a long shot, a wild hope. Using the sharp point of her pick, she began to carefully, painstakingly chip away at the base of the fissure, widening it into a small opening at the back of her new hearth. It was delicate, terrifying work. One wrong strike could bring down a slab of rock. Finally, it was done. With trembling hands, she built her first fire, using dry twigs and the last of the oats to catch a spark from her flint and steel. A plume of thick smoke billowed out, filling the small cave. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought she had failed. Then, a draft caught. The smoke swirled, hesitated, and was then drawn backward, sucked into the opening she had made. It vanished. Outside, she scrambled up the ravine wall and saw it. A thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke emerging from the fissure 100 feet above, dissipating instantly into the wind. It worked. The relief was so profound it made her dizzy. That night, for the first time, she slept in the deep, secure warmth of her own making. Her systems grew from necessity. The water seep was her lifeline. She dug it out, creating a small, clear pool. To keep it from becoming a muddy mess, she lined the bottom and sides with flat stones. Then, using the dense clay she was excavating from her home, she painstakingly built a small, raised cistern next to it. She mortared the stones with wet clay, packing it into every crevice until the basin was watertight. Now, she could collect a few gallons of clean water at a time, a precious reserve against freezing or drought. The goats, Nan and Billy, were not just companions. They were a vital part of her ecosystem. She expanded the dugout, carving a separate, smaller chamber for them, connected to the main one. It was dry, safe from predators, and insulated by the same thick walls of earth. Their body heat added a surprising amount of warmth to the entire shelter, and their manure was not waste, it was gold. She hauled the rich, dark soil she was excavating out onto the ravine floor. She mixed it with the goat manure and leaf litter she gathered from the base of the skeletal trees. In a spot that caught the most midday sun, she built 3 long, raised garden beds, walled with stones to protect them from runoff. It was back-breaking work, carrying bucket after bucket of soil, but it was an investment in the future. Her money was almost gone, and she needed supplies that she could not dig from the earth. She needed more salt to preserve meat, seed potatoes, and maybe, if she could afford it, a heavy wool blanket to replace the threadbare one she owned. The walk back to Providence Gulch was different this time. She was leaner, harder. Her hands were no longer soft and blistered, but covered in a thick layer of calluses. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair a tangled mess. She was a creature of the ravine now, and the town felt alien. The whispers started the moment she stepped onto the main street. The stairs were thick with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She was the ghost they had all expected to be buried by now. She walked directly to Gable's Mercantile, the bell above the door announcing her arrival like a judgment. Mr. Gable was behind the counter, totaling his ledger. He looked up, and his face registered a flicker of shock before settling into a familiar, condescending smirk. "Well, look what the wind blew in," he said, loud enough for the other customers to hear. "Still playing in the dirt, are we, girl? I suppose you've come to take my offer of a warm bed and a decent meal." Ilara ignored the bait. She placed her items on the counter with deliberate care. A large bag of salt, a small sack of hearty seed potatoes, and a thick gray wool blanket. Her hands, rough and stained, looked stark against the polished wood. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. "This will be all," she said, her voice even. Gable laughed, a short, barking sound. "Potatoes? You think you're going to grow potatoes in that godforsaken hole? You're a bigger fool than your father was." He tallied the cost. It took every last coin she had. As she turned to leave, he called after her, "Don't come crying to me when the first deep freeze comes. We all know how this story ends." Leading her goats back to the ravine, the heavy blanket now across her shoulders, she did not feel shame or anger. She felt only the cold, hard weight of her purpose. Let them talk. Let them mock. Their words were just wind. They could not touch her here. Back in the shelter, she planted the potatoes in her prepared beds, tucking each one into the dark, rich soil like a promise. She set snares along the game trails at the ravine's rim, and soon had a steady supply of rabbits, the meat stewed over her fire, the pelts scraped and cured to add another layer of insulation to her door. The first true snows of winter arrived not as a gentle dusting, but as a thick, heavy blanket that muted the world. Inside her dugout, the rhythms of her life narrowed and deepened. The world shrank to the glowing heart of the fire, the soft sound of the goats chewing their cud in the next chamber, the steady drip of the seep filling her cistern, and the weight of the wool blanket on her sleeping form. She was utterly alone, but for the first time in her life, she was not lonely. She was the sovereign of this small, warm kingdom of earth and stone. The stories in Providence Gulch took on a life of their own. Hunters tracking deer near the high country reported seeing a thin wisp of smoke rising from nowhere in the middle of the washout. It was unnatural. The tale grew with each telling. Some started calling her the Ravine Witch, a wild girl living in a hole, charming animals and living on roots. It was Mr. Gable who gave her the name that stuck. "She's just a foolish girl living in her father's folly," he declared one afternoon in the Mercantile. The Folly Girl. The name was cruel, and it spread through the town like a contagion. The ravine itself, once the washout, was now often called the Widow's Hole, a place of pity and doom. One day, a trapper named Brant, a man known for his rugged arrogance, made it a point to track the smoke to its source. He appeared at the top of the ravine, a hulking figure against the gray sky, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He half slid, half climbed down to her small, cleared space on the ravine floor. He peered at her shelter entrance, a crude door made of scavenged wood and rabbit hides, then at her small garden beds, now covered in a protective layer of snow. His lip curled in a sneer. "So this is it," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. He kicked at one of the stones lining her garden. "Living like a badger in a burrow." He looked at her two goats, huddled near the entrance. "You and them goats will be froze solid by the first deep freeze. The coyotes will pick your bones clean by spring." Ilara stood by her door, her axe in her hand, saying nothing. Her silence seemed to unnerve him more than any argument. He spat on the ground. "It's your funeral." He turned and climbed back out, leaving her in the ringing silence. His visit was a test, a small tremor before the earthquake. It proved her isolation was complete. The deep winter descended, locking the world in ice. Ilara's life became a monastic routine, dictated by the needs of her small world. Wake before dawn. Check the snares at the rim, a quick, cold journey into the wind. Use the pick to break the thin layer of ice on the cistern. Milk Nan, the warm milk a welcome gift in the cold air. Feed the goats their meager ration of oats. stoke the fire, the most important task of all. Her stockpile of firewood, gathered from the deadfall in the ravine, was her measure of life. Each log was precious. The days were a quiet meditation of work. She mended her clothes with a needle she'd had the foresight to buy. She scraped and treated the rabbit pelts, sewing them together to make a warmer blanket. She carved a wooden spoon from a piece of cottonwood. Her world was small, but it was ordered. The warmth of the fire, the earthy smell of her home, the soft bleating of the goats, these were the pillars of her existence. She was not just surviving. She was presiding over a system that worked. The howling wind was no longer a threat, but a distant song. The wolves came during the coldest week of January, a pack, lean and desperate, drawn by the scent of the goats. She heard their first howls from the rim of the ravine, a sound that vibrated deep in her chest. She secured the hide and wood door, bracing it with a heavy log. The goats were restless in their pen, their fear a palpable thing in the small space. For 2 nights, the wolves circled the ravine. She could hear their claws scrabbling on the rock above, their frustrated cries echoing in the still air. They could smell life, warmth, and food, but they could not reach it. She sat by the fire, her axe across her lap, listening. Her dugout was a fortress of earth. They could not dig through it. They could not break it down. On the 3rd morning, the howling was gone. They had moved on. Her shelter had held. She had built well. Then came the blizzard of '83. It was not a storm. It was a war declared by the sky. It began not with snow, but with a wind that had a voice, a high, screaming keen that stripped the bare branches from the trees and scoured the frozen ground. The air grew thick and white, the snow falling not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding curtain that erased the world. It was a physical force, a hammer that beat against the land, burying everything in its path. In Providence Gulch, the community's confidence, built on sturdy log walls and decades of frontier pride, shattered in a matter of hours. The barns, built tall and wide, were the first to fail. The immense weight of the snow, accumulating faster than any man could shovel, crushed their roofs, burying livestock in a tomb of splintered wood and suffocating white. The wind found every crack and crevice in the town's cabins, driving icy drafts deep into living spaces. The mercantile's large glass windows, a symbol of Gable's prosperity, exploded inward under the pressure, turning his store into a vortex of snow and wind. Panic set in. Firewood, stacked in open-sided sheds, was quickly buried under 10-foot drifts, a cruel irony of fuel that could not be reached. Families huddled together, their fires dwindling to embers, feeding them chairs and tables to stay alive. The cold was an invading army, relentless and without mercy. The town that had pitied Ilara as a fragile, foolish girl was now itself fragile, its systems collapsing, its people trapped and freezing in the very homes they believed were symbols of their security. 5 miles north, at the bottom of the washout, Ilara was not fighting the storm. She was living beneath it. The wind howled and raged 100 feet above her head, a terrifying but distant symphony. The snow, which was death to the town, was a blessing to her. It drifted over the edge of the ravine, piling up against her entrance, sealing her in with a wall of perfect, soundproof insulation. The temperature inside her dugout remained steady, the immense thermal mass of the earth around her holding the fire's warmth like a stone oven. Her fire burned brightly in its stone hearth, the smoke drawn cleanly up the fissure, invisible in the chaos outside. Her cistern, deep within the earth, was cool but unfrozen. Nan and Billy chewed their cud peacefully in their pen, oblivious to the apocalypse unfolding above. Ilara sat on her small stool, mending a tear in her shirt, the flickering firelight casting a warm glow on the clay walls. She was warm, she was safe, she had water, food, and fuel. The town was wrong. They had built to conquer the wilderness, to stand against it. She had built to be a part of it, to let its greatest furies pass over her. Her shelter held. On the third day of the blizzard, when the world outside was a white fury, a sound came that did not belong. It was a frantic, muffled banging on her door. It was impossible. Nothing could be alive out there. She grabbed her axe, her heart pounding, and listened. The banging came again, weaker this time, followed by a desperate scratching. She moved the log brace and pulled the heavy door inward. A figure, more snow than man, collapsed into her shelter, falling to the earthen floor in a heap. As the snow melted from his face, she recognized him. It was Brant, the trapper. His face was a waxy, bluish white, his beard a solid mass of ice. His dog, a tough, wiry creature, whined at his side, its fur matted with frozen snow. Brant's eyes, barely open, widened in disbelief as the warmth of the dugout enveloped him. He stared at the fire, at the goats, at the neat stack of firewood against the far wall. He had been tracking a snow-blinded elk when the storm hit, had gotten lost, and was preparing to die when his dog had caught a faint scent of smoke and warmth, leading him here. He coughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You're alive," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. He tried to push himself up and failed. He was on the edge of freezing to death. This was the man who had mocked her, who had sneered at her home and promised her a frozen grave. Now he lay helpless on her floor, begging for the life he had so casually dismissed. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a simple, human fact. A man was dying. She had warmth to give. She pulled him closer to the fire, wrapping him in her own precious wool blanket. She ladled warm broth from the pot over the fire, a thin soup of rabbit and potato, and patiently spooned it between his cracked lips. He drank it greedily, the warmth slowly returning color to his face. As his strength returned, he told her of the town. He had passed near it, a landscape of buried roofs and desperate silence. "They're dying, girl," he said, his voice raw with a new, terrible humility. "The whole town, freezing in their beds. Gable, his boy is sick. A lung fever. They can't keep the house warm enough. They're burning the furniture." The image of the town that cast her out, now suffering, did not bring her triumph. It brought a dull ache. She looked at her firewood, each piece of victory she had won from the land with her own sweat and blood. It was her life, her security. Sharing it was a risk. Not sharing it was an act she could not live with. She made her decision. She helped Brant to his feet. She took a smaller, rough sled she had fashioned from cottonwood branches and began to load it with firewood from her stockpile. She added a bundle of dry kindling and a small sack of potatoes. She gave Brant her spare rabbit pelt blanket. "Follow the ravine west," she told him, her voice steady. "It will shield you from the worst of the wind. It will lead you toward the town." He stared at her, at the offering on the sled, and for the first time she saw the arrogance in his eyes break, replaced by a profound, shattering shame. When Brant stumbled back into Providence Gulch, pulling the small sled behind him, he was met with stunned disbelief. He was a ghost returned from a white grave. He told them his story, his voice hoarse but clear, in the freezing confines of the meeting hall where the town's survivors had gathered. He told them of the girl in the ravine. He described her shelter not as a hole, but as a fortress. He spoke of the impossible warmth, the calm, the steady fire, the animals safe and sound. He told them she was not just surviving, she was living, while they were dying. The news landed like a thunderclap. Mr. Gable, his face etched with fear for his feverish son, listened, his cynicism finally broken by desperation. There was no mockery left in him, only the raw terror of a father about to lose his child. He, along with 2 other men, followed Brant's exhausted directions back out into the storm. They followed the sheltering wall of the ravine, a landmark in the featureless white, until they saw the almost invisible wisp of smoke that Brant had described. They dug through the massive snowdrift blocking the entrance, their movements frantic. When they finally broke through and pushed aside the hide door, the contrast between the 2 worlds struck them silent. The warmth hit their frozen faces like a physical blow. Their eyes, accustomed to the blinding white of the storm, struggled to adjust to the soft, golden firelight. They saw what Brant had described, but seeing it was different. It was a miracle. The neat stacks of firewood, the clean cistern of water, the 2 goats placidly chewing in their pen. On a small shelf carved from the clay sat a small, perfect stack of potatoes. It was an entire world, ordered and sustained, hidden in the heart of the chaos that was destroying them. Gable's gaze fell upon Ilara. She stood by the fire, her face calm, her expression unreadable. She was not the ragged, foolish girl he had dismissed. She was a woman who had faced the very worst the world could offer, and had not only endured, but had bent it to her will. All his certainty, all his practical, sensible pride, crumbled to dust. His eyes filled with tears that froze instantly on his cheeks. "We were wrong," he choked out, the words torn from him. "My God, girl, we called you a fool. We were the fools." Ilara did not smile. She did not offer a single word of vindication. Her victory was not in their shame, but in her own quiet strength. She simply gestured to the pot simmering over the fire. "There is soup," she said, her voice even. "Eat." Then she turned and began helping them load more of her precious firewood onto their sled, her actions speaking a louder, more profound truth than any words of triumph ever could. Her grace was as solid and unshakable as the earthen walls around them. The storm broke 2 days later. The firewood from Ilara's shelter saved Gable's son and at least 2 other families who had been on the verge of freezing. The story of what the town's leaders had found in the washout spread as the survivors began to dig themselves out. The transformation in the community's perception of Ilara was absolute and immediate. The derisive nicknames, the Folly Girl, the Ravine Witch, vanished overnight, spoken only in tones of deep shame. People began to call the place Shelter Ravine, a name spoken with a reverence that bordered on awe. In the weeks that followed, as the town struggled to rebuild, a new path was worn to her door. They came not with pity, but with respect. They brought her things, a bag of flour, a new knife, a bolt of sturdy cloth, not as charity, but as trade for a few potatoes or a bottle of fresh goat's milk. More than that, they came for knowledge. They asked her how she had designed her chimney so it wouldn't smoke. They marveled at her clay-lined cistern. They studied the way she had braced the entrance to her dugout. She, the uneducated orphan, became the teacher. She shared what she knew freely, without pride or resentment. The impact on Providence Gulch was profound. The blizzard of '83 became a harsh but necessary lesson. When they rebuilt, they built differently. The new barn was built lower to the ground, its roof at a steeper pitch to shed snow. Several families, whose homes had been on the windswept plains, abandoned them. The following spring, they began to dig new shelters into the sides of nearby ravines, using Ilara's principles of earth-sheltered living. They used the land not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a partner in survival. Her methods, born of desperation and instinct, became the new wisdom of the region. Her story traveled with merchants and trappers, becoming a frontier legend, the girl who dug a home from the earth and survived what no barn could. Years passed. Ilara's world expanded, but it remained centered in the quiet strength of her ravine. Her 2 goats became a small, healthy herd. Her garden beds, enriched each year, produced a surplus of vegetables she traded in town. She built a small stone and clay smokehouse for her rabbit meat, and her cheeses became highly prized. She never moved into town. She never sought the approval she had finally won. Her home was here, in the place everyone had called worthless. She would often sit at the entrance of her shelter in the long summer evenings, watching the sun set, its last rays painting the ravine walls in shades of orange and deep purple. The wind would whisper far overhead, a familiar, distant friend. The goats would bleat softly as they settled for the night. She had been stripped of everything, family, home, status, and cast out with nothing but a worthless deed. But in that worthless place, she had discovered the most valuable thing of all, the deep, unshakable knowledge of her own strength. She had not just built a shelter against the storm, she had built a life.